All right, so last week we got to hear from Chopo primarily, and Eric a little bit, but telling us from his perspective what's going on, what are his needs, what are the things that we should be praying about for them. So on the flip side, we're going to focus a little bit more on fellowship and what they've learned. How do you apply some of the things they've learned? And I think one of the things that you'll hear, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, right, is that they went and heard from Chopo and heard from his elders and were encouraged and built up and learned something from them of how we need to be praying and serving one another. And so they're going to take some time to share some of those. And I got my questions on the phone, so we'll just start with the questions. So first, tell us a little bit about how the trip came about, what was the thought process, and ultimately, what were you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so the trip came about because probably a year or so after meeting Chopo and him starting to come to the church and preach on a yearly basis, it seems like, he started to ask the question about us coming and sending a group to Zambia. And if you know me and you know kind of how we've approached some of the other missions projects and things like that in the past, I just kept telling him, you don't have to ask us to come. That's, don't feel like you're obligated to do that for any sort of a reason. I mean, genuinely, do you need us to come? And if you genuinely need us to come, then we'll show up. And so I think, for right or wrong, and you can rebuke me on this, brothers, but like for a couple of years, or maybe more than that, I just said, no, we're not coming. Unless you, again, desperately need us to come. And so he was he persevered, persisted in asking, convinced why it would be a good idea to come. And so as we planned that, as he laid out kind of what the purpose and everything was, I can't say exactly whenever we presented that to the deacons and presented to the elders to begin with, that what the outcome of that was exactly what we presented to begin with. But I think a big part of that was we didn't exactly know what some of those elements would be. So some of those changed along the way, but I can't say that they changed for anything but the better. Mm-hmm.
So I think the request that came, just to give the, what need was there that we were going to go and fill, was every year Faith Baptist Church, they do a large missions conference where they pull in all of their different church planters and all their different missionaries, and they give updates. So, it'd be great if we could do something similar and we could pull in all of our partners to come here to Lubbock and have them give direct updates to you guys. That would be awesome. Obviously, I think the video interviews are kind of filling that place. But for Chopo, what they do at their church, Faith Baptist Church, is actually pull everybody in once a year, and they center around a missions conference where they give the update. So I think the need that Chopo finally was able to articulate to Eric was, hey, we want you to come, and we want you to provide the teaching for this missions conference. And so that was, I think, the catalyst, the need that was presented that, finally it kind of started to make sense to send somebody to do something rather than just to go and visit.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think, like going back to the TMAI conference in March, when we were sitting there, Conrad and Bayway was talking about so many churches in their part of the world do a summer missions conference where they do exactly kind of what Chopo was doing, and it was something that I hadn't really thought about. We talked about how we might implement something like that here, and then kind of determine we already have something implemented like that where we do this throughout the summer. But yeah, another component to what I was observing that Chopo was doing during that conference was he was again kind of laying out to the congregation exactly what their focus and emphasis is as a church regarding not only those church plants that they already have in place, but the places that they intend to plant a church in the years ahead. So it's kind of putting them back on the same page again. And then I think incorporating us to sort of lay out kind of a biblical perspective of missions to the congregation so that they hear the same thing from someone else, which is helpful.
Yeah, so one more point on that, and we can move on. But in terms of the purpose, obviously to fulfill a teaching role for that church, for that conference, and Chopo said multiple times, and of course we recognize this, but he said, y'all just need to come and see it. It'll just help you. It'll help you guys. It'll help your church. It'll help us. It'll help our church. And it's just that relational component that I think Chopo was probably more attuned to than we were as we were thinking about going for a visit. And I think that's one of the things that was absolutely present on this trip, was just the strengthening and the deepening of relationships. They've seen our faces. We've seen many of their faces. We made the long journey to go see and encourage them, and they were an encouragement to us. So, and I think that was a thing that Chopo, maybe that wasn't enough 2 years ago to convince us to come, or 3 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever. But, providing the opportunity to teach, in addition to just strengthening the relationship by visiting and getting to shake hands with the different saints that were there, I think was another purpose that Chopo probably had more clearly in his mind than we even had in our mind before we left.
And I imagine a part of that is getting to meet Sandy, right, and all the other guys over there. But talk a little bit about meeting him. Maybe that's a surprise that he's now coming to Lubbock
Next week.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about him and what to expect and why he's headed this way.
Yeah, so Sandy is one of the elders, and wonderful guy, and I have some comments about just the hospitality that we were extended while we were there, but it was so interesting, all the different elders that the church has, and they're all just so different. We commented on this multiple times because we went to each of their homes for a meal, got to meet their families, and they prepared a meal for us, and we just fellowshiped with them. But the different personalities of the elders, very, very different people, different guys for sure. And Sandy, as you hopefully you'll be able to sense from the brief time that he's with us, just a really joyful guy, funny, definitely has an energy about him that is, I would say, somewhat. He kind of brightens up a room, I think, when you're in his presence. So yeah, I hope that y'all enjoy getting to meet him. But he was coming. I think they were coming for Radius, a conference in L.A. And Chopo was like, "You should just go to Lubbock for a few days." And he was like, "Okay, I'll do that." So in addition to his 28-hour flight, he's going to add a flight from I think it's L.A. to Dallas and then back to Lubbock. So he'll be worn out, but he better be ready to teach Sunday school next week. So come and you'll get to hear him.
I think that's a good prayer request too, that the guy gets where he's going on time and has a bit of rest before he gets here, because if everything goes perfectly smoothly, he'll have about 5 hours sleep after a 25-hour plane ride or something like that.
He arrives Saturday night at about 12 at night. And
we're asking him to teach this next Sunday.
So obviously you set out with a purpose, a plan to go to teach at the conference, and then to deepen relationships, and that's headed that direction is what you're hoping to do. Now in hindsight, did you accomplish what you thought you would? Were you surprised by anything that came out of it that maybe caught you off guard?
Yeah, I think that element of getting to know their elders, getting to see their church, getting to sort of further deepen that relationship as we talked about, and it was encouraging to realize how like-minded they are, they're set up so similar. If you went to their worship service that was, I guess, a few hours ago, it would have been very similar to what you see here on a Sunday morning. You would have had singing in Bimba, right? I kept telling everybody it's Bindi, but it's Bimba. Yeah, so when I said to you Bindi, I meant Bimba is the language. So that was encouraging, and then to see kind of the heart of each of those elders, that was really encouraging. And again, they're on the same page, they're doing the same thing. I'm thankful for that, and this may come up later, and many of you have heard me say this, and I suspect that you knew I was going to say this, but the encouraging thing to me was also the day that we spent with Noah, because we had gotten there, we're visiting places, we're seeing people, we're rather tired. You go to preach Friday night, conference starts Friday night, we go have dinner with somebody, teach twice on Saturday, go have dinner with somebody, wake up, you go out to the middle of nowhere to go teach, and I go to do the church service. I have a meeting with the missions committee after that. We get back to the hotel or the lodge at 2:45, and we're supposed to meet Noah at 3, and we're both looking at each other like, is there any way we can get out of this? And thankfully we didn't. Thankfully the Lord had a much better plan than what my plan was and all that. But
even though when he arrived to pick us up, the radiator in his car exploded.
his car died pulling into
There's
the parking lot.
There's like smoke billowing out of it, and
I'm kind of
thinking, oh, this is the Lord taking care of us and giving us a way out so we can go rest.
Plus, I'm going like, if he takes us 20 minutes out in the middle of nowhere and it dies, how are we ever going to get back? But anyways, so yeah, and then in typical like Zambian fashion, you know, the mechanic pulls up in his car and says, "Here's my keys. Go wherever you want. I'll fix his car while you're gone." Okay. So he drives us out to this area that's really a poverty area is the best way I can describe it. And it's an area with electricity but no running water. He shows us his church, and we have some video of that if you want to see that church. And get in your head this picture of Noah. He's an indigenous pastor that's there in Zambia. He's a Zambian guy. He's well educated, well spoken, joyful as we're going along. He could be doing a whole host of other things and living in a different place, but he knows that there's a church that needs to be in this area, and he knows that there needs to be Bible preaching in this area. So he's committed to live like about a block from the church. As we walked over to his house, and they had built this house in this area, and you know they haven't been able to finish everything. I just remember his ceiling wasn't finished. You could see the light from the outside coming in. He's committed to live in a place where he has to haul water to his house, and he's preaching verse by verse through Colossians on a Sunday morning. I mean, he was probably in Colossians 7 hours ago, and he's been in Colossians for something like 3 years. Because he says, you know, one thing is yes, the group that he's preaching to is probably a little bit less educated, so he's slowly going through and slowly presenting them with truths, and he's putting them in such a way that they can be readily understood. And little by little by little, I think it's genuinely the work is doing the word within that church there. So I say all that from the standpoint of you connected to one of those church planners that I know Chopo wanted us to. We saw what was going on, and frankly, we were great. I mean, to me, that's just been a huge encouragement. I've said it numerous times that it's sort of like I think we have a new hero of the faith with this guy named Noah, who joyfully lives in this place and has got a difficult work ahead of him, and he's committed to be there for the rest of his life.
Yeah, so the neighborhood he lives in, very poor. The church has electricity, as we found out they were practicing. They were doing choir or worship practice, and
they had an amp that worked. Their
amp worked. Our ears bled. It was very loud. I mean, I'm just like, and there were like 3 people in there, like electric guitar. It was a little bit. I don't know if they was just playing around or what, but they have electricity. They don't have running water to the church. They have an outdoor baptismal, and that's what we saw was pretty typical. Was an outdoor baptismal. So we'll present that to the deacons in a few weeks about building this one out here. But
well, and the cool thing about that, and I've shared this with some of you, is that how do you fill that up where you don't have water?
Exactly.
Where you don't have a spigot right there. Well, church member by church member brings their 5-gallon bucket that they take to their house, and they just go down to the well, and they just form a line, and they just keep going till the baptismal's filled up.
Yeah, that was the point I wanted to make was just.
Sorry, I stole your thunder.
But that's okay. That's how they fill that thing up, was bucket by bucket, walking down to the neighborhood spigot to fill up their baptismal. So just goes to show you the commitment that they have, and just the continual faithfulness with a lot of what we would consider a lot of barriers, you know. So that was definitely good. For me, I think there were multiple questions in there. I'm trying to remember which one, but maybe you asked surprising thing. So much of this trip for me was personal, having lived overseas and having worked through most of my struggles with being overseas and then being here and getting back into that kind of context. I probably drove Eric crazy by kind of comparing everything that I saw with what we knew and experienced in Asia. But the biggest thing that was so surprising and really refreshing to me was just how easy the people were to genuinely connect to. In China, there was language barriers that were very extreme, and then cultural barriers that were also very extreme, to where even the believers that we worked with got to know them. And they were, of course, friends, but they were like Chinese friends. And whenever you said Chinese friends, what you kind of meant was like, yeah, there's someone that you kind of have some kind of a shallow relationship with, but it's very difficult to go deep with them for all those reasons. And I kind of came on this trip expecting something kind of similar, to meet people and to, have some measure of friendliness with them. But it was just evident almost immediately that, the language barrier was non-existent. The cultural barrier was almost, it was definitely there, but it was very overcomable. And then obviously just union in Christ. All of it made it so easy to enter into a conversation with some of these people, and you can tell, like, wow, like we could be very, very good friends. I'd have no issue bearing my soul to you, asking for prayer for anything, knowing that you know what I'm saying, you know what I'm asking for, and that you would actually meaningfully pray for it. So I was unprepared to see that. I was kind of expecting something more similar, like what we had over whenever we were in Asia, which was kind of a formality of a friendship, but really not able to go deep with people. So for me, that was the biggest surprise, and it was a refreshing one for sure.
I was also refreshingly surprised that you actually know Chinese. I've heard that for years, and I was like, yeah, but is it just sort of like 15 words? And then he's in the grocery store speaking Chinese to somebody. I was like, and they're talking back to him. He does know Chinese. So
there were a lot of Chinese people in Zambia. They were building all their airports and infrastructure and everything else. And Kitwe is on the copper belt in Africa, so copper mining is the main industry there. And so a lot of them come over, and their bosses, the Chinese, end up working themselves into a role of a boss over the Zambians, which of course creates all kinds of tensions, as you can imagine. The Chinese won't let the Christians go to church on Sunday. They make them work. So that was one of their complaints. I was like, yeah, the Chinese are not, they're not Sabbatarian, we'll just put it that way.
Did you have anything that you were most surprised by?
Just, as you think culturally surprised, I was surprised by, I don't, and you probably think this is nuts that I keep bringing this up, because I probably brought it up 1,000 times on the trip, but like all the people out walking night, day, in the middle of nowhere, that surprised me. People living, kind of what seemed like out in the middle of nowhere, where we drove out into the country, and just I wasn't ever really eager. Anytime we got in the car and went on a long distance ride through the city was okay, but the long distances, it's like you're going to see some close calls on the road, and just hopefully you're not part of those.
So you talked a little bit about the hospitality already with the elders. Tell us about the accommodations. What did they feed you? How did they treat you?
They were probably, that's probably the greatest display of hospitality I've ever been around, on a day-to-day consistent basis, person-to-person, family-to-family.
And I've been to your house.
I know.
That's true for me too.
Wow. It was convicting, personally.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we both talked about that. In terms of whenever Sandy's here or something like that, just how we're hospitable to them. The funny thing was, and hopefully this isn't being recorded.
It probably is.
It probably is. Okay. Well, I'll phrase this then. It was a good thing. It wasn't a bad thing. I was kind of surprised. Like, everybody had basically the same thing when you went to their house. It was a huge feast, but it was always sort of the same thing. It'd sort of be like, but it'd probably be like if you came here and everybody said, "Oh, we'll make hamburgers for you." Okay. Yeah. But everything, a lot of fish, it seemed like, which good. But yeah, probably a challenge, at least for me, in my remedial eating skills, which I don't show that physically, but was Shima. This cornmeal-based substance that basically you form into your spoon for each bite, and maybe
with
that
your
was
hands.
with
Form
your
it
hand.
with your hands.
Like make it into a ping pong sized ball, push it with your thumb, so you get a scooping device. Because a lot of times, and they would be, again, hospitality, they would see us coming in some occasions and put knives and forks and a napkin on the table. But in most of the cases, you'd sit down and there would be no napkin, there would be no knife, there would be no fork, and you just went at it with your hands. That was different.
Yeah, that was I've never been to Africa, so eating that was interesting. The food was overall bland. salty. It was good.
That's a rude way to put it.
But compared to what some other places I've been, it's a little bit, and they said that, it's not spicy.
Somebody said, was Chopo or somebody joking that like the spice trades never made it to South Africa?
They never made it to South Africa, and so, it wasn't bad at all. But, this is being recorded, so sorry for everyone I've just offended who's watching this. But it definitely wasn't spicy, which I kind of was expecting. It was good. We didn't get sick. I kind of expected us to just have some stomach issues just with being exposed to different things. But it sounds like all of y'all got the stomach bug while we were gone. So thank y'all for carrying that for us.
The funny thing, too, was that we talked about, and this kind of happened going to Thailand one time, that they had a Western Sizzler there, and that was the only place we did get sick at. But we go to that restaurant in Kitwe, and the logo on the front is like this Native American Indian with a full headdress. I was like, well, that's different. Yeah. And then you go inside and there's like silhouettes of buffalo and of canoes. And it's like, the American West. I was like, I didn't expect to see that here. But I guess maybe that was a foreign restaurant then in that sort of sense.
They put us up in a guest house, which was nice. It was very, very nice accommodation. So, yeah.
Connected to a ministry called Life Song, I think, and everybody, incredibly hospitable.
Yeah.
So what was it like to worship with them and their services? Talk about the service a little bit specifically, but then also talk about the brotherhood of the saints and how that was evident to y'all pretty much immediately as well, and what that universal truth looks like for us.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really get to hear them preach because that's what kind of the role we were filling. They would typically start, the first song would be in Bimba. When they had special music and you recorded one of those, it was in Bimba. I thought there was just a particular joyfulness when they would sing in Bimba. I mean, I'm not saying it was just like robbed when they would sing in English, because everybody's speaking both languages. But to see their joy when they sang, and it was like, I still remember, I think it was Brian that we met in the airport coming that made the comment, something along the lines of, you don't have to teach Zambian people to sing, it's just like in them, to harmonize everything. And that was really seemed evident in that way. There was just a wonderful, joyful spirit. The other thing that I brought back that we've talked about was, and I think this kind of connects the way they have their service set up. There's not a Sunday school hour like this ahead of the service. There's about a 15-minute break, and then afterwards, everybody takes their chairs, and there's like two of these. They go into small groups, essentially. There's two inside. There's probably three outside that they just take the benches out under the trees, and they go through the 4 to 5 questions that the pastor submits as it regards the sermon that was just preached. And, I mean, there's genuine, authentic wrestling with how the sermon applies to their life. And that comes out in a multitude of ways whenever you're talking to the people in the church. And that was a joy to see. That was something we kind of talked about, like how can we implement something similar? Probably not doing it the exact same way, but maybe you could include an insert, with those sermon questions, and people go off to lunch, and encourage everybody to kind of go through those sorts of questions. And so that was a wonderful cultural thing that I was encouraged by, that again, we've talked about last week, that we're learning from them, kind of learning the way they did a prayer service there was a little bit different. It was helpful. How they directed visitors was interesting and helpful and beneficial, I thought.
Yeah, the singing was such a shock. Just strong voices. The ability to harmonize, on multiple levels, it was remarkable. And just the joy that was evident. And Chopo, what was so funny about him, and as y'all know him, if he didn't like the way the congregation sounded, he would pretty much say, no, do it again. And he would call everybody out. It was he'd be like, I can't hear you. And so he would do this kind of thing from the pulpit, because he would lead worship sometimes. And really, he would not let the congregation enter into a song half-heartedly. He wasn't going to let it happen. So just to see the way that he kind of interacted with the crowd in a little bit more of maybe informal is the right word to describe it, but that was fun. But and to see how the congregation responded really well to that kind of encouragement from him. But yeah, the singing was really rich. I preached at a minority church, which was all in Bimba, so all the singing, all the preaching, everything was in Bimba. I had to use a translator on that at that time, but really encouraging. Yeah, so that was really fun, and it's interesting just to, you can almost see the unity in the body, and you can, even though you don't know what they're saying in their songs, you just sense these are God's people worshiping Him, and it was really a joy to be a part of it for sure.
And you brought this up already with the hospitality side, but genuinely, you'd feel at home there if you went. You wouldn't feel like you're around the world. You wouldn't feel like you're 9,000 miles away. It was just you were amongst believers, and I think that unique quality that exists here amongst believers clearly connects there. The other thing that was encouraging was like observing their internship program and getting to meet two of their interns, Prince and Costa, and seeing these guys and their heart for pastoral ministry and Chopo's intentional training of those guys, giving them roles and responsibilities. That was helpful to a lot of things that we've been kicking around here.
Yeah, so back on the singing, if anybody struggles singing loudly, next time Chopo is here, you get to sit beside him. Or Des for that matter. We'll just fill up the whole front row.
Or listen to Sandy. If it's next Sunday, listen to Sandy sing. I bet you he'll be the same.
Yep.
Yeah.
So tell us what we have to learn from Faith Baptist Church.
Well, one thing that rebuked me, and I think this is a tendency within my own heart, but also I think it's just part of our nature. But when we see misuse of something, the reaction that I find myself gravitating to is to just avoid even its proper use. And so I multiple times, because I've been in a context where, I've seen churches talk a big game about planting multiple churches, or I've been in contexts where I've heard about short-term mission trips, this and that, and you see all this excess, all this, you can just look at the big game that some are talking about, and you just know something's not quite right. There's a lot of misuse, misapplication in this, and the temptation is just to distance yourself completely from anything that looks like that. And but to be in a context where you actually see a church that is very serious about planting other churches, that is very serious about training up men to become pastors, that is really serious about visiting their missionaries, that is really serious about all the things that we're talking about, and to see it being properly used, to me was just a helpful reminder. Misuse should not prevent proper use. And so that was a rebuke to me. So interns, again, I've seen churches full of interns doing all the things, and you're just wondering what's really going on here. But, the two guys that we got to meet, these are young men who love the Lord, who want nothing more than to eventually, become a pastor of a humble church in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa. Like that's what they feel called to do. And just see the program that's formed around that it's not like the interns are gobbling up every possible ministry of the church so they can get experience, which is kind of how it's been in some places I've been. And so that was refreshing, and it to me it kind of gave me the ability to take a step back and to wrestle with thinking about some of these types of things for our church as well, rather than just to follow my temptation, which would just be to completely isolate myself from them or ignore them. So that was probably the main thing that was a takeaway from me. I think about and of course we've talked about if eventually we grow, that it's time to plant another church. These kinds of conversations have been happening, but I think will continue to happen, and I think we'll have a great example and help in Kitwe Baptist Church there in Zambia to help us even think through some of those things when that time comes.
Yeah, so interns and how those function, church planning in a region, and supporting, and kind of how supporting those church plants operate, even as it regards missions and informing the congregation regarding what's going on in those ministries and what, missions look like. And I don't know, there's a lot of you that can probably have wrestled with this far more than I have, but I always think about, we talked a little about this, what people call a missionary, and you get all sorts of definitions, and there's all sorts of conferences on an annual basis just to determine what a missionary is. And so, people would critique that Faith Baptist probably calls those guys that could be 20 miles away from them a missionary, and yet there needs to be a church in that place. It'd be easier in some sense for us to call them a missionary because they're not in our context. But again, to think about that in terms of here, where there are cities in our region that need a Bible teaching church. So that was informative, I think. And again, kind of like how you maybe take the sermon, take a time of teaching and make that applicable in the context of everybody and how they're wrestling with that and applying that. Again, learning, I think, hospitality in that sort of a sense. Trying to think what else. I think just in some sense, it's okay if everything's not neat and tidy and polished, and watching some of that. And maybe my coworker may disagree with this, and feel free to, but I feel like I'm a guy that likes it neat and tidy and polished. Don't look at my office, but seeing like it, it's okay on some of those things and the way things came together and that they operated. That was a good reminder. And just seeing again how, a diverse group of elders operated in unison with one another, how they ministered to the church, how they cared for the needs within the church, how they, functioned with different groups to take care of different needs within the body. So there are a multitude of things I think that we learned.
Sure.
Well, it really shouldn't surprise us that we're partnering with the church that is doing things well, doing things faithfully, doing things effectively, but in many ways they're doing things that they've got way more experience than we have at this point. So Lord willing, we're in a situation where we learn about church planting, certainly polish our view on missions and how to approach that, but that's encouraging to have friends like that are doing good work.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit, has there been any discussion about sending teams to potentially visit our other partners over the coming years?
Yeah, I think you're going next week, right? I think coming out of that was convicting in that regard. It was educational in that regard about the benefit of it. So I think that is something that probably lines up in years to come, that maybe that is on an annual basis an intentional, focused region, pastor, family. And in some cases that might be more information gathering, which at the same time can be encouraging. And I think one of the, I'll just say this, and again, if he's listening, Ricardo's listening. Hey, but talking about Ricardo in Colombia, that might be a good idea that we send a couple of folks to Colombia just to get to see him, meet his family, somebody besides me meeting his family, and seeing what the context is there in that part of the world, seeing what the city's like, the situation's like, what his plan is, what the church looks like. That can be incredibly helpful. And at the same time encouraging for him and his family and that church, I think. So I think while there's nothing definite, nothing set in stone, I think there's probably a little bit of a door opened in that regards, into seeing the benefit of that, where, I was probably shying away from that. I just don't want the folks that we're getting to know and that we already trust to a great degree to feel like that we have to be there. And we have to expend resources in that way. If that's beneficial and they determine that on their own, again, we've learned to trust them because they're like-minded, they're theologically sound. If that's how they determine this best serves them, then we're all in, but they don't have to have us there in some sort of a way.
If you think about partnership, you think about just sending money, and there's a need for that, and everyone would agree that even in the New Testament you see that at play. But the partnership is always so much more than that. It's always the relationship. And so I think that, as we think about strengthening the partnerships that we have with these different, ministries around the world, like what Eric's saying, if it makes sense and there's a mutual desire to connect on that level, then I think just this trip to at least to I think us proved that there was a tremendous amount of benefit for their church, hopefully for our church, on what this trip accomplished. And so, for the future, I hope to see that, maybe on an annual basis.
And I don't know that you have this in your queue, and maybe this comes out of this, but I'll ask both of you guys. To me, I like after this, I kind of look back and go, I think we're on the right track. I felt, kind of the focus, the objective, sadly, it's probably a unique way that we've kind of approached international missions. But I looked at all this, and it was encouraged in that regard. I mean, not that there's no room for improvement, not that there's anything we couldn't polish. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I think we're moving.
And I mean, we've told you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you consider, especially about Chopo, is he's coming to the United States. He has partners here. He's having to go to multiple churches and speaking at multiple places. And just for somebody from our church to show up at his place and take the time to be there, to preach, to share, that's incredibly encouraging for I mean, he's got elders, he's got friends, he's got support, but for the two y'all to show up and say, hey, we're also in this with you, I think is incredibly helpful.
And I think as a result of all of this then is also that we're educated to talk to people about what's going on within the missions program at the church, because you have new people that are coming in constantly, and they're going, exactly. Well, what are you doing in this regard? And look, we're just not going to put on the website, we've planted 15 churches around the world, where we have, contributed in various capacities towards that. I mean, there are active, real, legitimate things going on. We need to know that to be able to express to others that are coming in kind of how we approach missions and what our involvement in that is and what our commitment is towards that going forward. And again, that's going to be so radically different, I think, than what's historically come out of churches as it regards the missions program, where you send a few bucks to scatter it amongst a whole bunch of people and you've got a map outside. Maybe in 10 years there's 50 people on the map, but still, if there's 5 people on the map and we're committed to those 5 people, again, when you commit to what's going on at Faith Baptist, it's not really just one person. Right. There's a whole smattering of churches that have been impacted, and that was encouraging to see. So we've got to be able to convey that.
So with the last 4 minutes, you accomplished certainly multiple things in addition to what you set out to accomplish, but think in hindsight, what are some ways that you think this congregation needs to be praying about for this church because of what you've learned from the trip? How can we be praying better in the days ahead?
Praying better for FCL.
Because we've got Chopo's prayer card out there, so we've got prayer requests for him. Talk about FCL. What should we be thinking about in reflection of an incredibly faithful pastor, incredibly faithful elders, congregation? How should that challenge us in our prayer life?
I think that we would be faithful to the stewardship that we've been given, with the relationships that we've been given with these people in these places. And that if the Lord in his sovereign plan so desires, that there would be additional relationships that develop in the way that he's brought these relationships, which has kind of been, I think, unique.
I think for my answer to that would be more local, and maybe just we'll keep it as simple as I pray that the Lord will make clear to us what the path forward is for kind of a maturing engagement with the region, West Texas, Eastern New Mexico, whatever that looks like, because seeing what they're doing there in Zambia, there's so much that's so common to what we're doing here, but they are actively sending out people in the areas that need church. Obviously, our context is very different, so I don't know all the answers to that at this time, but that in the Lord's timing, he would make that path clear to us as a church.
I think it's interesting how many times you specifically get asked, hey, I'm in this town, do you know of a good church? And often the answer is, not really.
Yeah.
And so that should be convicting about our region.
Well, and I mean, just rejoice. Last night at the reception, I was informed that there was a family that was sitting back over here like a month and a half ago. Where are you from? We're from Odessa. And we've decided to start coming here on a Sunday because we just can't find a church. And we've been listening in online. And to be able to tell them, oh, you actually have driven past a church now that's in Andrews that we know. We know the elders at that church. And there's a church in Midland, and we know the elders. We know the pastor in that church. And to direct them in that way. Now, we haven't seen them since, but I've been informed they're in one of those churches.
Yeah.
And that starts to exist more in our part of the world than it has in the past. And that we can, that's a legitimate connecting point to everything that we're talking about. And this trip helped solidify that.
All right, any last comments? 15 seconds each. It's like a debate.
Thank you all for letting us go.
Yeah, absolutely. And encouraging and praying all along the way. That was real.
And I did post a lot of pictures in the missionary update channel from the trip. So some of the guys we talked about, some of the churches we talked about, those are all in there. So if you have any questions about them, just send them in the channel, and I'll answer any questions that you have.
And Logan Heinrich is a trooper.
He did awesome.
Yep.
So
that's all for you, Rowan. Let me close this in prayer, and then we can practice our hospitality. Father, we're thankful once again to hear about the work that you're doing and the ultimate glory that you receive from that work. We pray that that's evident, that all points to you, points to your Son. And we pray that we're good stewards of the relationships that we've been given and the opportunities we've had to build new relationships. We pray that we'd be faithful in that we would connect in ways even across oceans to people that we have something in common with as we're indwelt by your Holy Spirit. We also pray for the vision, the mission moving forward, that you would give us opportunities to pour into people's lives that are closer to home, that you would show us opportunities that need to be met, and that you would provide equipped people to go and to be able to start the work that needs to be started. Just pray that we're humbled in all these things, that we rely completely on you. In Jesus' name, amen.